Hi Year 10, this is just a bit of feedback about the homework questions that you had to do last week. I'm just going to talk you through each of the answers just so you can use this to help you make some corrections or improvements to your work. The first question was a multiple choice question. Hopefully you went for these two options here, that a resource is a stock or supply of something and it has a value or a purpose to people. A fossil fuel is an example of a resource, but it's not the only example. Some of them are limited in their supply, but not all of them. And obviously resources are available all around the world. So the most two logical options to go for were A and C. Question 2 gave you this map showing the origin and food miles of some fruits and vegetables at a greengrocer's in Ely in Cambridgeshire in 1960 and again in 2016, and we can see the distances that some of those fruits and vegetables have travelled in 1960 and the distance that they've travelled in 2016. And we needed to use figure 1 and our own knowledge to explain why food miles for foods such as apples and strawberries have increased since 1960. Really important that we use figure 1, so we make reference to some of the products or distances or whatever that we can see in this map here. And we want to be thinking about trying to explain why those foods now travel further in 2016 than they did in 1960. And there's a few reasons for that. Let's have a little look at these reasons here. So food miles for foods such as apples and strawberries have increased since 1960 as there's more demand for this seasonal produce all year round. That's a good thing to mention, that some of these things like strawberries or apples, they only grow at certain times of the year, but consumers want to eat those things all year round. In order for us to meet that demand, we need to import this produce from abroad. So that's why maybe the strawberries are travelling from Spain rather than from Kent, and we can see the difference in those food miles here. Second reason is that there's also more consumer demand for choice and more exotic foods. The example I've given here is papaya from Malaysia. So we can see that in 1960 that wasn't being eaten by people in this part of the UK. In 2016 it is something that is being eaten. So people's attitudes towards food have changed, and we can't grow those kinds of foods in the UK. Our climate's not suitable, and therefore we've got to import those. The final thing is also that sometimes it can be cheaper to import food from other countries. So apples from New Zealand, for example, we can grow apples in the UK, but actually it might be cheaper, even though we've got to fly them or ship them 11,700 miles, it still might be cheaper to do that. So they're the main three reasons why food miles have increased within the UK. If we then have a look at this question at the bottom, how does increasing food miles lead to a larger carbon footprint? Remember, that idea of a carbon footprint is the impact that a product is having on our environment, particularly in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide that it's releasing and the contribution it makes to climate change. So the distance that food travels when imported is known as food miles. When food is imported from abroad, this has to be done by air, road or sea, and these forms of transport release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, contributing to a larger carbon footprint of the people consuming those products. So the first step is that simply moving that food from one place to another is going to release carbon dioxide. We want to back that up really with a second point. It is worth 2 marks. It's worth us saying two things. Second thing I've chosen to say here is that products also need more packaging, which further increases their carbon footprint. If you need to ship something from one side of the world to the other, you need to make sure it's well packaged, otherwise the food's not going to be in very good condition by the time it gets there. So if we have a look at the question on the back then, we can see that we've got these two maps, one showing rainfall in the UK, one showing population density in the UK. Both of the maps have a key in order to help us interpret them, and it's really important that we use that, particularly as the question tells us that we need to use figure 2 and 3 to help us answer this question. Question says, using figure 2 and 3, explain why some areas of the UK experience a water deficit. Now, it's important that we maybe unpick what we mean by that term, and the start of the answer gives us a good definition of that. Water stress or water deficit is where demand for water exceeds supply. Essentially, an area doesn't get enough rainfall to actually meet the demand for water from its population. As shown in figures 2 and 3, areas such as the southeast of England receive little rainfall, around 466 to 640 millimetres. And I've taken that number by having a look at the southeast of England on my map, having a look at the key, all right, and making sure that I include the units within that as well. Then also gone on to say that those areas have a high population density of more than 200 people per square kilometre. Again, I've looked at the same area on this map, I've looked at the key, and I've made sure that I've given the units of measurement as well. So those areas having more than 200 people per square kilometre, and in areas such as these, water demand will exceed supply, resulting in water deficit. So making the point that areas with less rainfall and more people, that's why they experience water deficit. Final question then was to explain how water supplies can be managed to meet demand. Now, managing water supplies can be done in two ways. If we think about how we're going to meet that demand, there's a couple of things we can do. We can either reduce the demand for water, we can reduce the amount of water that people use, or we can actually increase the supply of water to that area. If we think about it like a set of scales with demand on one side and supply on the other, there's two ways we can get that set of scales to balance. We can change one side of the scales, or we can change the other. So we want to think about both of these things within our answer. This is the most obvious one, reducing the demand. This is the one that people tended to forget. So encouraging households to save water can help to manage water supplies. For example, installing water meters in homes can make people more conscious of the amount of water they are using and therefore less likely to waste water. I've given the example in our lessons before about maybe being charged for every megabyte of data that you used on your mobile phone versus having unlimited data on your phone. If you were charged for every megabyte, you'd absolutely be more conscious of the amount of data that you were using. So installing a water meter is one way of helping to reduce demand. Second thing, maybe thinking like water saving techniques like efficient appliances like dishwashers and washing machines that maybe use less water. Other things you might have mentioned, things like having a water butt in your garden to harvest rainwater for watering the plants, having a grey water system, any of those kind of water saving techniques that we've talked about. So that helps to reduce the demand for water, but water can also be moved from areas of surplus to areas of deficit. For example, water transfer schemes like the Elan pipeline move water from North Wales to Birmingham, which helps the city to increase their supply of water. Now, I've given that example, but there are other ones you might have mentioned. Certainly transfers of water from the Lake District down into Manchester and Liverpool, even from parts of the far north of the UK, in places like Northumberland, plans to move water from there all the way down to London. This is how we deal with supply. We can't make it rain more, but what we can do is move water from one area to another. Hopefully that's been useful for you. Hopefully you can use that to make some corrections and improvements to your exam questions.